Okay, so good afternoon to all. My name is Olivier De Schutter. I teach international human rights at the University of Louvain, and it's a great pleasure to be here with Nina Panikova to discuss the results of a study prepared for the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions concerning the role of national human rights institutions in bringing a human rights dimension to poverty reduction strategies. This is a very important moment because many states are now trying to implement the Sustainable Development Goals in national action plans. And this may be an important opportunity to revisit, in the light of the SDGs, the poverty reduction strategies they are implementing. And in the course of this revision, to take into account human rights in a more explicit manner. And in the study, the attempt was made to identify a series of principles that could be taken into account by governments with the support of national human rights institutions in order to be much more basing these poverty reduction strategies on human rights. And part of what we will examine is how this can influence, in particular, the measurement of poverty and thus the measurement of progress towards eradicating poverty, which, as you know, is SDG number 1. So the 10 principles that are presented in the study and, of course, detailed in the guide that the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions has developed on the basis of the study, try to basically answer 3 questions. The first question is, what is the added value of a human rights-based approach to poverty reduction? What difference does it make to bring human rights in the picture when states for many years have been trying to grow the economy, to reduce poverty, to combat inequalities, to spread wealth? Why would they now need to use human rights more explicitly? Well, to answer that question, 3 principles are put forward. First of all, if you ground a poverty reduction strategy on human rights, you are forced to distinguish policy commitments based on charity, such as we've seen develop after the financial and economic crisis. Many countries decided to establish programs that led to cash transfer schemes, for example, protecting the poor from extreme deprivation, but without accepting to be held accountable for results and without accepting the idea of being monitored for the progress in eradicating poverty. So the first added value of a human rights-based approach is to introduce this dimension of accountability, of independent monitoring of progress in the governance of poverty reduction schemes. The second added value is that in order to be grounded in human rights, poverty reduction strategies should take into account the specific situation of certain groups in society that are traditionally underprivileged, invisible in public policies, lacking participatory rights, making it more difficult for them to influence those policies. And to do this, we need to understand whom poverty mostly affects by disaggregating data. In other terms, looking at whom the poor are by looking at criteria such as age, gender, religion, language, ethnicity, disability, depending on the kind of issue that is most important in the state concerned. Thirdly, a human rights-based approach to poverty reduction should be based on the poor being able to participate in making the key choices, identifying the key priorities, and proposing solutions. That is absolutely vital. It's useless to try to work for the poor without involving them in building the knowledge of policymakers. The second question that the principles seek to address is how to actually measure poverty and how to measure progress in eradicating poverty. Well, here 4 principles are put forward, and the first one is that we need not simply to arrive at raw numbers, raw figures, but identify the contours of whom the poor are. In other terms, we need to understand the causes of poverty by identifying whom is most affected by poverty. And of course, this goes back to the point of using disaggregated data. The second principle, principle number 5 in our list, is that we need to move beyond the usual household surveys that are the traditional tool that statistics agencies use in order to measure poverty. Household surveys miss out on a number of groups that are particularly vulnerable. For example, those who are placed in institutions, those who are homeless, undocumented migrants who may not wish to have contacts with public officials, or even poor families who fear that if their poverty is known to certain services, the child may be removed from the family and thus create a risk of family life being disrupted. So there are reasons why these household surveys are actually misrepresenting the reality of poverty. And so we have to have specific methodologies to overcome that problem of the so-called missing poor. Principle 6 is that we need to understand poverty not simply by statistics, but also by stories that people in poverty can bring to the table so that we understand which experience they've gone through leading to poverty. And that requires, again, a plurality of methodologies to understand poverty. Principle 7 is that we need to move beyond an understanding of how big a problem poverty is and which legal answers are given to that problem, to understanding the reasons why many people in poverty do not actually invoke the rights that they have or claim the benefits they have a right to. There are a number of reasons for this phenomenon called the non-take-up of rights, including shame, the complexity of procedures, the numerical illiteracy of many families who cannot use online forms to claim benefits, the bad experiences people may have had with social services so that they do not want to encounter these services again, or indeed the fear of being denounced to authorities when you are, for example, an undocumented migrant. So this phenomenon of non-take-up of rights is one that should be incorporated in the assessment of poverty in a country. It's important to know whom the poor are. It's important to know what the rights are that they have. It's also important to understand if they indeed exercise these rights and enjoy them in practice. The third question that these principles address is which safeguards should be taken into account in measuring poverty, safeguards that relate to data protection and privacy issues. 3 principles are put forward here. First, there are rules concerning the processing of personal data, which essentially should be anonymized in order to be processed and to feed into statistics, something that could be detailed, but we don't have time to go into much detail here. Secondly, we need to allow people, before being defined as belonging to a national minority, to self-identify as such. It is a right for a person to be treated or not to be treated as a member of a national minority. And principle 10, the third principle under data protection and privacy issues, is that we need to inform the person about what shall happen with the data that that person provides, which is a principle of transparency. Now, these principles should guide national human rights institutions in the advice they provide to statistics officers, to public administrations working on poverty, in order to make sure that this work to eradicate poverty is grounded in human rights. And it has specific implications also for the measurement of poverty. And here I would like to highlight, perhaps based on the very rich information that was contributed by some 16 members of the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions, covering 16 jurisdictions, I'd like to comment on 4 issues. The first one is the essential but often underestimated question of the multidimensional approach of poverty based on the attributes of human rights. Let me explain this. Very often, definitions of poverty focus on lack of income. In other terms, it's a monetary definition of poverty. And that, in fact, is a very poor way of defining what it is to be in poverty and to experience poverty. People in poverty may, for example, have more difficult access to healthcare systems. They may be living in inadequate housing facilities. They may be facing specific forms of discrimination in the hands of public authorities. And so all these dimensions, beyond the purely lack of income dimension, should be covered in the way we try to assess the scope of poverty. Indeed, if we focus alone on income poverty, on the lack of income, the solution to eradicate poverty will be to increase the income by increasing, for example, the minimum wage or social benefits, unemployment benefits, and so on. But in fact, there are many other ways in which poverty could and should be tackled by improving, for example, the quality of public services, by supporting free access to certain goods or services that allow people, even with a low income, to benefit from such goods or services. We can make progress in eradicating poverty without necessarily this having to be simply based on increasing incomes. And that's very important. It broadens the imagination of policymakers on one hand. On the other hand, it gives us a much better understanding of what it is to experience life in poverty. The other issues related to poverty measurement are, secondly, the disaggregation of data. We need to understand not only the absolute numbers of people falling under certain measures of poverty, but also whom these people are. What are the different groups affected? Because there may be different explanations for people experiencing poverty. We need principle or third remark, we need to rely on a range of methodologies to collect data, as I said, in order to have also qualitative information about the experience of poverty. And fourthly, we need to ensure that the poor participate in designing the methodologies. And these are the criteria that we used in order to assess how poverty is measured across a number of European countries, and we benefited from the inputs of national human rights institutions to do this. What are the results? Well, first of all, if we examine which jurisdictions measure poverty using a multidimensional approach, we leave aside Denmark, which has no measure of poverty that is functioning today. So we are left with 15 jurisdictions rather than the 16 from which information comes. But out of these 16 jurisdictions, we note that actually only 7 really have a multidimensional definition of poverty. And even then, not always fully aligned with the full range of human rights, which should allow to identify the different dimensions of poverty linked to, for example, healthcare, food, housing, and other components of economic and social rights. The other jurisdictions either could not provide information that is usable, or had a measurement of poverty based exclusively on income, or had only partially taken into account the need to move to a multidimensional definition of poverty. And so it's a picture that could be improved, and that national human rights institutions involved in shaping the national action plans that shall develop now in order to implement the SDGs could contribute to. On the question of whether or not data are adequately disaggregated, again, the picture is a very mixed one. Only 5 jurisdictions out of a total of 16 or 15, not counting Denmark, have actually satisfactorily developed a methodology to disaggregate data about poverty, linking poverty to criteria such as age, sex, ethnicity, religion, and so forth. In 6 other jurisdictions, there was some disaggregation of data, but not on all relevant grounds. And it is very striking that many states remain quite reluctant, for example, to measure ethnicity, which is a very suspect ground to use, of course. Some countries believe it can be problematic to classify people according to their ethnicity, yet it would allow to understand much better the role of ethnic discrimination based on ethnic, on ethnicity, on membership in an ethnic group as a source of poverty. And finally, in 4 jurisdictions, we had to conclude that the disaggregation of data that took place was not non-existent, but what was quite weak. On the question of the missing poor, it is the question here was whether the statistics officers of states that are in charge of measuring poverty had been developing methodologies to reach out to those groups that usually are underrepresented in household surveys. And unfortunately, we have very few good practices in this regard. Although Germany and Croatia have been pioneering work in this regard, and other national human rights institutions may wish to seek inspiration from those examples. We also note some excellent practices in involving the poor in defining how to assess poverty. This was done, for example, by the Scottish Human Rights Commission in a forum tackling poverty through human rights they organized in 2014. And perhaps most remarkably, it was done in Belgium by the Service to Combat Poverty, Insecurity and Social Exclusion. This is developed since now 25 years. It's every 2 years a broad participatory dialogue about poverty that is really co-constructed with people living in poverty in order to make sure that their experience is fully taken into account. And so the guide that was prepared by the European Network on National Human Rights Institutions includes a number of recommendations to national human rights institutions. I'm very briefly going to go through them. The first one is that the national action plans that the European countries are now adopting to implement the SDGs should be tested, examined, analyzed, assessed for their conformity with the requirements of a human rights-based approach. The guide that was prepared by ENNHRI has all the information required to allow national human rights institutions to do this. So it's a tool that can be used in the current discussions on the years 2020, 2030, during which states are developing these national action plans in order to make sure they're grounded in human rights. And we very much encourage national human rights institutions to use that tool. The second recommendation is to ensure that in the domestic legislation, discrimination on grounds of social condition, poverty, or indeed property is adequately reflected. To me, as a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, we have in Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, a requirement that states ensure that economic, social and cultural rights can be enjoyed by all without discrimination on grounds inter alia of social condition and property. Yet in very, very few states, is this actually something that courts do pay attention to, the discrimination based on poverty? Yet we all know that the poor people living in poverty not only suffer from a lack of income, they also are constantly facing shame, stigmatized and treated with disrespect by public authorities, and indeed sometimes by private bodies or private employers. So the prohibition of discrimination on grounds of social condition is really a tool that should be revived. It's been largely neglected until now. The third recommendation is, of course, to make sure that the statistics officers that collect information about poverty should take into account the requirements concerning privacy and personal data protection. And that would be also one way to reassure people who are involved in these measurements that they shall not be stigmatized as a result, or indeed that the information they provide shall not be used against them. That seems to be extremely important. The fourth recommendation is that in the implementation of human rights, that we focus not only on the rights on paper, the law in the books, if you wish, but also on the effective enjoyment of human rights by the people concerned. And that requires that we use indicators that are not only structural indicators looking at institutions put up or laws adopted, not only process indicators that examine the budgets that are invested in certain policies, but also outcome indicators. Do these policies actually make a difference? Do they work? Do they reach the people that need most to be supported by a human rights approach? The fifth recommendation is that we measure poverty by taking into account that some groups are generally underrepresented in general surveys that are based on household surveys. And for this, again, the examples of Germany and Croatia are interesting. Specific methodologies need to be designed to reach out to these underrepresented groups, these missing poor. Otherwise, paradoxically, our measures of poverty will be based on not necessarily the experience of those who are the most difficult to reach and need perhaps their views to be most systematically taken into account. Recommendation number 6 is that in some cases, it may be interesting for national human rights institutions to train those responsible for developing national surveys and updating national statistics on poverty in order to ensure that they take into account the 10 principles we listed in their work. And finally, and this is probably the most important of all recommendations, the 7th recommendation, is that NHRIs could convene participatory processes, participatory fora, in order to discuss these issues. And here I'm free to say, because I'm not a member of it, although I am Belgian, that the Service of Fight Against Poverty, Insecurity and Social Exclusion really set a benchmark as regards how to work with people in poverty in order to bring their experience to the table and make sure that we move from policy making in favor of the poor to policy taking based on the experiences that the poor report and the understandings that they provide of their situation. The most recent report, for example, published by the Service of the Fight Against Poverty, Insecurity and Social Exclusion, was about how the people in poverty relate to the ecological transition and the need to move to more sustainable lifestyles. And it was extremely rich to see that many obstacles they face in adopting lifestyles that are more sustainable were simply not thought about by the policies or the policymakers that are designing these policies, because their experience had been neglected. So it's a source of wisdom, it's a source of knowledge, it's a wealth of experience that we can that we can use by building solutions with people in poverty. And that is the last message that you will find in this guide. I close by really thanking you for your participation, but also thanking the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions, because there is an academic study that is behind this, but the preparation of the guide, which is very user-friendly and very full of good ideas as to how national human rights institutions can do more in this respect, is really their work. And I'd like to thank them for making it so digestible and useful.